Well, thanks to all of you for joining this episode of the Metaversial Minute. I'm your host, Richard Boyd, a parallel entrepreneur who's been tilting at these windmills of real-time 3D and interfaces for about 30 years. As you can see, this is our holiday episode. I'm very honored to have my guest today, Tim Bajarin, who I met, gosh, what was it, 26, 27 years ago, right, Tim?
Yeah.
I was with a company called Vertus. I think the graphical internet had just been born about 1993 is when I sort of think about it. And in 1995, I wrote a book about the 3D internet, saying, hey, the 3D internet's coming. And I couldn't find my copy of 3D Website Builder, but I did find like the Japanese version of it that we released that year. So we're going to talk today with Tim. Tim's a celebrated columnist, one of my favorite technology analysts who I've followed for the last 25 years or so since we met. You've written for Time, New York Times, Forbes, a variety of other journals and online broadcasts that you've contributed to. So thanks again for joining us all the way from the left coast. I love your little museum of technology behind you. Is that a live image or is that
it was until the pandemic where we had to close our office. But, I've been collecting these items for 30, 35-ish years. And, I don't know if you can see it, but I got an original Mac in there. I think
there it is. Yep.
Apple II. I got a Mac. I've got one of the original Polaroids. I have the original Idea Pad from Apple.
Oh, yeah.
The original Trio, the original Palm Pilot. You name it, I've got them. They're now in boxes, and I'm hoping to be able to reassemble this at some point. I have a few of them set up in my office at home, but my home office is much smaller than what I had in my conference room where this sat for about 30 years. So
I have a few of those things. I've got the original Mac laptop that I used to write that book that I was just describing. Yeah. And of course, I think one of those early Macs and the Palm Trio. I actually started a smartphone company in 2001 before there were smartphones. So let's get to this whole idea of the metaverse. And I know I've been following some of your commentary in social media and other periodicals recently. So just interested to hear, given our history, as we were talking about just before this, when we first talked 26 years ago, we were talking about how the page metaphor was still the interface for computing, despite different attempts at Magic Leap, at Taligent, and other places and by Alan Kay from Xerox PARC, some of the folks who actually created that first Windows interface that captured Steve Jobs' imagination and the mother of all demos and all that. But why 26 years later are we still using this two-dimensional page-based metaphor to interface with all this increasingly powerful computing we have? I'd love to hear your perspective on it and what you think about this whole metaverse thing.
Well, first of all, the reason we're still stuck on it has to do with more of a technology issue. We're still working in a two-dimensional world. When you actually pop up your PC, the idea of trying to create a 3D immersive experience on a 2D screen is very difficult. Now, there have been some rather interesting experiments to be able to do this that use 3D glasses and that bring that kind of to the forefront. But that's why I think when you actually take a look at virtual reality, that's the actual technology breakthrough we have to get us away from the static 2D page turning model to one where we're getting into immersive. And I think that's what's caught the attention more of anybody who's ever tried the MetaQuest or one of the VR headsets, because they realize that this kind of has the potential of being the next computer interface for a lot of people. The problem is it's a technology issue again. The headsets, of course, are still relatively expensive. We don't have a lot of content built for these headsets. And then you get Mark Zuckerberg throwing out his vision, which kind of clouded this a little bit because he put such a swing towards VR and then you look at what Apple's done with AR kit starting in 2017, and there's over 10,000 AR apps on the for iPad and iOS right now, which is again really more of a two-dimensional superimposed on top of a virtual world environment. And you've got, basically a lot of confusion that still exists on one, what is the metaverse? And two, what is the proper platform? And three, how are we going to get it delivered to the masses, right? And I do think the work that Meta and Zuckerberg is doing is important because at the very least, he's investing in the future. I don't know how he makes money in the short term to justify 10 billion in revenue expenditure on this, but I applaud the fact that he is doggedly going after his vision, regardless of the cost. At some point, his investors are going to rebel, but at the moment, he's basically pushing us in a direction that is very, very interesting regarding this new user interface being one that is immersive and three-dimensional. On the other hand, if you actually think about the metaverse as the way Apple has approached it, meaning that you're actually looking at the world, but then superimposing information on top of the real world, that definition is one that probably is going to gain traction faster with consumers. Apple uses it really well with the IKEA app, for example, where you can go into your room and it'll be empty, and you'll have a thing on the side that has couches and lamps and coffee tables, and you can put those from IKEA in the empty room and see what it might look like. And I think you're going to see a lot of those type of things. I mean, the Pokemon Go idea was a really good, fun one for kids. And shoot, even my wife got into it, chasing Pokemons all over parks. And, that kind of wet the whistle in a sense to try to explain AR. But VR is tougher in the metaverse and VR, because you really have to go to a headset, and preferably one that has a lot of quality so that you have great images, the fidelity is really good, things of that nature. But I do think that we are moving towards that, in that direction. I think that within the next, and again, we've been talking about this for 20 years, so I'm not going to say it's coming tomorrow, but I think the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to flush this out. And I think that concept of what you proposed even back in 95 and 96 will probably become reality, but it's going to come through a different medium as opposed to a personal computer and a tablet.
Yeah, so you said a couple of things there. I think it's interesting to see that Apple once again seems to be, I mean, if that's what you said, that Apple has a better vision, more clear vision of the metaverse, and is executing better perhaps than Zuckerberg is so far. And I think so I agree with you. I think it really comes down to a question of design, but also, if I've been sort of drafting an open letter to Mark Zuckerberg. I'd be interested to hear what you would think about it. But one of the things I've said to him is sort of what you just said, which is, it's not all about the hardware. It's not all about stereoscopic 3D vision in order to really harness the true value of what I think Neil Stephenson was talking about with the metaverse years ago. What when we got together as part of the 2006 Metaverse Roundup, where a whole bunch of technologists who played with VRML and all the other previous technologies got together and said, okay, how do we actually manifest this thing? we really talked about just the fact that real-time 3D is a powerful super communication medium, and that you don't need to put on a headset in order to participate in that. Games are one expression of it, that proves that you can have these rich, compelling interactions with other people and with environments that are very convincing without going stereoscopic 3D. I had a lot of those same conversations with James Cameron, working with him on, when he started really adopting stereoscopic 3D. The issue with it is, no matter how much we improve fidelity, the fidelity of the image, the latency, the refresh rates, some humans, some large number of percentage of the humans out there will not ever be comfortable in stereoscopic VR headsets. They just won't.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
but the AR, the overlays, or being able to use your phone or some other device and have an overlay in the real world, that, Pokemon definitely proved that works, even if it's just light two-dimensional sprites that are in that world. We all did think, when I first saw Magic Leap, I saw one of the early demos when I was at Lockheed Martin, and we were looking, and they basically said they had solved the unstructured, Z buffering problem, where you could just go into any random world out there, regardless of how bright it is and how cluttered the environment it is, and be able to draw 3D objects and characters within the scene and have it Z buffer properly. But they still haven't achieved that. Of course, it's a really hard problem. But what do you? Actually, that's a good question. What do you think about what's happened with Magic Leap?
Well, that Z buffering in what they promised is what got them, what is it, 2 billion in investment. But it was solving, it is a huge problem. And the other thing that I think was a part of an issue for them too, is they didn't really have the right business model when they first started this. This was people and investors betting on a technology without a business model. And it's kind of funny that it's this kind of goes full circle. During the .com market era, that was the same problem there. They would come up with these websites that was part of this big web trend, and they had no business models behind them, and most of them fell by the wayside. When I saw the early demos of Magic Leap 2, I was just like you and others, that I was astonished. I know Spielberg's response to it was extremely positive.
The demos were beautiful.
Where he could see the movies really delivered in this medium someday. I don't know whether he actually invested in it personally, but I know a lot of the VCs and the creative types put significant amount of money into it. But and I would argue that it's the same scenario with any metaverse thing that somebody comes and shows me. I'll ask them not about the technology, I'll ask them about the business model. And in the work I've been doing with one of my partners, Barton Goldenberg of ISM, we actually go into metaverse projects on the business aspect, not the creative side. We're happy to look at what they're doing at the creative, in the creative context. But what we bring to the table and we argue with them about is, look, it's one thing to have a good application, but unless you have the customer service, the sales, and all of this stuff ready to go as a part of what you launch, it's not going to go anywhere. And that's actually where we're at again. It's just funny because, we're reliving the .com era with the metaverse era, where the same thing is people are showing us great technology, they're showing us great applications. But unless you have a good business model, and that's why I question what Meta's doing with what they're doing, because, and again, the good news is he's got big pockets, and if he wanted to fund it by himself, he could do it and do it for years.
Still a lot of money. Yeah, still a lot of cash on the balance sheet for sure.
Yeah. But unless you actually build a business model around whatever you're doing, I don't know how it succeeds. And so that's one of the things we push pretty hard in the consulting project I'm doing with my friend Barton, because he is an expert in CRM. And he's gone in and he's done the CRM projects for, Shell Oil and Exxon and the big guys. And none of their their stuff really took off from the standpoint of expanding their businesses until they built a CRM layer. And that's why guys like Oracle and Salesforce and all these guys, all of a sudden became huge multi-billion-dollar companies because they took care of the business aspect of whatever the application is. And it's the same thing here.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Shell on those folks, because the last Metaversial Minute I did was with one of the folks from the CIO office at BP, because years ago we had helped them go into the virtual world, and they were great because Daru, who was the CIO at the time, or CTO, actually really listened to those of us who've been doing this for a while. Like I remember in 1994, I was standing on stage with Jaron Lanier, talking about VR and headsets, and I was making the same argument then that I'm making today, which is it's really good. You can really get some richer, deeper experiences if you can get a comfortable headset and you're the type of person who's comfortable in those worlds. But it isn't necessary to really unlock the value of this media type, which is, you have every medium you ever used before in human communication available to you, and you have this immersion. But we've proven the medium out in four. Actually, it's really good only for four things. The ones that are really proven are, number one, entertainment. Collaborative 3D games have exceeded movie box office receipts for a long time. Then there's design, CAD design, especially collaborative 3D design is powerful. Then the next is simulation, being able to practice and simulate, whether it's a flight simulator or running a restaurant or whatever. We've now proven you can do it with simulation. It's that last one that's still proven elusive, and that's the interface. How do I interface information? And am I going to continue to use these 2D, page-based metaphors, or can I open it up into something more richer and deeper? Like, we play with Michael Crichton, who's behind me over here, with games and stuff years ago, and when he was working on Disclosure, and we helped design that interface of like, here's the vault of information you have access to, and it's a 3D world that you can go into, and everything's iconified by distance. So there's no folders hiding things. There's no overlapping windows hiding things. It's all just arrayed in this massive metaverse, as an interface. And, that seems to be the last mile of this, is how do we design something that has that? But going back to this, the BP guy, Joe Little, what they did is they said, you're right, it's proven, these other three areas are proven. So we're not just going to have meetings in the virtual world. When we have all of our folks all across BP meet, we give them a mission. So we create this like problem at one of our plants, and it's a 3D world, and it's game-like, right? So you got to go come up with a design solution to that problem. And it's not a one-day event, it's a 4-week event. And it becomes really riveting and exciting and compelling, because you get all the powers of simulation and all those other media types, but you're not just like creating an avatar and we're dancing in front of each other and talking. There's a richness to it of things you can do there, like time travel and going inside the human body or to the surface of Mars and all those things, as opposed to just meeting in an environment. So that's the last mile.
You bring up an important point, and we kind of discussed this earlier, but when you actually do look at the long-term role of the metaverse, it really is redefining the user interface between man and machine.
That's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where it's important to not only think about today, but to start developing in that particular direction, right? Because I agree, VR right now is great in the areas that you talked about, entertainment, simulations, etc. And then that's why I think the Web3 guys are so adamant about this being the next version of the internet, that the internet is more immersive, interactive, and goes beyond just the flipping the page metaphor. But I think the ultimate, and we did a project this is an interesting thing, but in the death care industry, dealing with the concept of virtual cemeteries and things like that. And one of the things that that particular project was clear on is that even, especially now, that even though the best experience of what we were creating would have been in the metaverse, meaning a VR headset, so many people don't have that we had to be able to create it. In fact, we built it in spatial so that we could use it on smartphone, tablet, PC, etc. And even though it was a virtually driven with avatars, it did give you that newer experience. But the ultimate would have been if we had it in the VR headset, right? And that's, I think, where the really big opportunity is. And this is where we'll go, but it's just going to be, it's years away. It's just years away.
Well, so I mean, I think that's really interesting that you brought that up. We haven't talked about this yet, but a few years ago, my father died. And I'd been going, when Ray Kurzweil would have his singularity conferences in New York and different places, right. I traveled to those and I've talked to him about what he's been trying to do for the last couple of decades, saving his, he's got a room full of all the information that his dad left behind. And he's been scanning it and saying, one day, I'm going to create this facsimile of my father who's going to live forever. So I did a sort of not a poor man's version of it, but with the technology I had available to me, which was machine learning. I scanned in all of his military records, all of his correspondence, and built an interest graph of him. And of course, using the early versions of Chat GPT, which was like BERT and GPT 1 and 2, I created the ability to actually talk to him. And for me, it was just for myself, and we used it as a technology demonstration internally, but I released him on the net. He's like reading the news, he's scoring news stories that he receives, listening to podcasts, watching YouTube videos, and then I could talk to him. And I ended up doing a whole tour of South America, I went to Buenos Aires and Medellin, and all these places everyone's really excited about the idea, will you have technology that allows me to commune with my ancestors and ask them questions about and get guidance around big life questions like, should I marry this person? Should I take this job? Should I move? And I just said, look, here's what I've done. You guys can just take this information I'm providing you. And they said, when is your product going to be ready? I'm like, I'm not making this product. I'm just telling you that I did this for myself as an exercise. But is it possible? For me, that thing that I created of my father was comforting, right? And I can't advise other people as to whether or not they should do it. But I think we are now looking at the breakthroughs just over the last month in Chat GPT, where now you can have richer, deeper, full conversations and dialogues with these Leonardo da Vinci, if you want, or whoever. I think that really does open a new sort of it's like a Marshall McLuhan moment where this technology we're playing with is going to change how we actually think about it. So, as I'm leaving my legacy for my children, I'm scanning everything. I'm creating my interest graph. I'm molding it. I'm recording stories. I'm doing things like this. And even for my son, I've done that since the day he was born. And now I've got this digital exhaust of me that can be harvested and preserved. So anyway, just that's a riff that you just triggered.
Well, when we studied the death care industry in general, I mean, that was a key component. The problem was a lot of people don't keep records of their discussions with their parents, and
neither did my father, right? He wasn't on any social media. He had no data exhaust, right? So I had to handcraft it the way I would a character in a game, really.
Yeah. Well, in my dad's case, he died like 35 years ago, and so it was none of this available. And we just happened to be finally going through some of his papers recently, which is kind of sad. We took it this long to get to it, but and we're discovering all these things, about him. We're not clear quite what to do with them, but the idea of being able to actually, as you said, speak to your ancestors and some of that, I think that is going to evolve as we apply these technologies. I know that there are services now that actually will allow that you can actually go to sit down with your dad and videotape him and then put the info in there. It's not AI driven. It's more of a record keeping model. But if you actually started to do that early on, because it's kind of funny, we like you with my son, he's actually 44 now, but I have amazing records of when he was born. We had these gigantic camcorders, right? So, but we still used it to record a lot of what his growing up and his little soccer games when he was 5 and 6 years old, etc. So I've got a really good repository for him, but I got nothing beyond the family that goes way back, which would be really interesting. My uncle, for example, was the White House chef for Harry Truman, and he was his private chef. And I would have loved to have sat in those. I mean, I did talk to him a lot about it when he was alive, but boy, if I'd have captured all of that, he had marvelous stories about working in the White House. And in fact, he was with Truman when he went over for the Malta discussions with oh God, I'm trying to remember, Churchill, Stalin, and him, and Truman, right? He was the fly on the wall in that particular setting, and I would have loved to have gotten stuff like that. But it's going to happen.
I always say that this is one of my little thesis statements. Is I read a lot of Marshall McLuhan, liberal. I'm a liberal arts guy, even though I got into technology later. But I always say that period of time was people. You hope that people sit down and write down and keep a diary and record the things that they're, especially if they're witnessing history. But then we got into the point, the last century, I say, was about the recorded image. It was the first time in human history when we could review events that are happening, whether recent or current, by looking at the footage. Like, let's go to the film, Jim, let's see, or Tim. And now I say this century is about simulation. I call this the simulation century. If I can ever finish my book, that's what it'll be called that. It's the first time when we could actually model, simulate, predict, and time travel, go back and forth in time to review things from different perspectives. And now we have the help of AI. So I think, AI really is changing the game a lot. And it's not crawling, it's leaping. It just leapt just in the last month, like I said. And we're still, even those of us who've been playing with it for a long time, are trying to understand what it means. How fast is this really going to be realized? What are the business models? Especially when you think that, that Chat GPT, even though there's a couple of versions of it out there, they're really controlled by, once again, it's monolithic. There's OpenAI, it's Google. What does that mean from a business perspective if there's this one pillar and then there's this massive mushroom of different kinds of applications built on top of it? What if they move that pillar underneath it and all this stuff falls? What does that do to the business, to the economy? How do we make sure we have a whole bunch of these, a bunch of flowers blooming of that capability? That's one of the things we're worried about. And I think, obviously people like you are thinking about it from your broader perspective, but I'm concerned about that. It's really powerful. It's extraordinary stuff. And yet it's, it's fragile in that, it's being controlled by just a few people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah. So anyway, like I said, I try to keep these short, but they never do end up being short because there's so much to talk about. And you're such a fascinating person who's had a front row seat for all of that technology arrayed behind you and all of the developments. So I'm glad we had this moment to capture some of your thoughts. And I hope we'll be able to do more of this. But what do you think is going to happen in 2023 with the metaverse? Do you have any predictions at all, since we're bumping up against the end of the year?
Well, I think the next big thing that will drive at least the concept forward is going to be more around AR, not VR. And I think the shoe to drop on that is whenever Apple gets in. There was a lot of talk that Apple might enter as early as the first half of 2023. That now has been debunked. It's now they're the rumors mill anyway, suggesting late 2023. That's a possibility. I know the things that still have to be done at the optics, at the battery, and at the wireless interface modules that may make it difficult even to still do it in 2023, and wouldn't be surprised if this gets shifted even to 2024. But I think we'll make some progress in VR from the standpoint of getting more people interested in. And the MetaQuest Pro, as it is now, is like $1,400 or $1,500. That's way
it's
too
extraordinary, though. It is really, that too is a big leap in capability, but the price point and just that friction is something I'm still concerned about. So how do we get it down to these?
Yeah, and that's why I think that's even tough in 2023. I talked to the guys who are doing the optics, for example, and while they believe they're there and they're getting their power draw, the power demands lower, you still have to have a battery that fits in the headset. You still have to have a radio that fits in the headset, and they've got to have more than an hour of battery if possible. And the radio has got to be powerful enough to sync with your smartphone. And we're just not there. And I don't think 2023 will give us that capability. The Qualcomm chipset that they just released is actually close, but I don't know if that's at the level where even Apple thinks it needs to be in order for Apple to bring this in. But the next big thing is I think we will refine a bit more around VR, but I think that we'll do more experiment with AR, and then the really next big leap will be whenever Apple enters.
That's great. Well, we look forward to it. We're always rooting for Apple. They always seem to push the whole industry forward with their design thinking. I think it's always good if there are more players than just one or two, like I just said earlier, but whoever does it, we're rooting for them because it will transform the industry.
I agree. We believe that Apple not only comes in with the technology, but they've already built up the business model, right? It's already connected to the App Store. It's already connected to a transaction model. Everything's already in place. They just need the front end and the perfection of the user interface. And it's this particular one is much more difficult because you're trying to miniaturize stuff into a set of glasses. And that's, to me, the tougher part, which is why I'm not optimistic we see it in 2023, other than maybe the end. I think this is more targeted for early 2024.
Well, that's a good prediction. So we'll plan accordingly. And once again, it's just been such a pleasure, Tim, to spend time with you. Thanks for all you've been contributing to those of us in the tech community over the last 30 years. And I know your son is following in your footsteps. That must feel very gratifying. I look forward to talking to him sometime in the future as well. Well, again, happy holidays from the East Coast to the West Coast. And thanks again for joining us today on the Metaversial Minute. And we'll see all of you out there in whatever form the metaverse takes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.